Hi, I'm Steve Miller. Let's talk about assembling your Ikelite housing for a wide-angle lens. Okay, now we're going to assemble the DSLR housing, and we're going to configure it with a super wide lens, a wide-angle zoom lens. So the first thing we're going to need to do is reattach the tray. If you were traveling, you probably took the tray base with its arms off of the housing to get you through the airline. So we'll reattach that with two flathead screws. You snug these up, but remember that you don't have to crank them down. You don't have to crank down anything in the Ikelite system very, very tight. Once your base is attached, and your handles are attached to the housing, you can move on to the camera and the lens. Once you've attached the wide-angle zoom to your camera body, next thing you're going to need to do is locate this spring-loaded mechanism that we use to convey the movement of your control knob to the actual zoom of the lens while you're diving. So what we're going to do is stretch this over the lens and allow it to rest on the grippy knurled section of the lens, so that when this slides back and forth, that's what's going to zoom, in this lens's case, from the 10mm range to the 17mm range. The next step after that is going to be to mount the camera onto the housing itself. So we locate the tripod screw at the bottom of the camera and the tripod screw on our base mount. Match those two up. And thread it together. This is a flathead screw. You can use a coin, a quarter, or a nickel will work fine to tighten it down. Whatever you use, though, don't crank it down. It doesn't need a lot of pressure to stay in place. Last thing I always do is attach the sync cord to the hot shoe on top of the camera. This is how the camera is going to communicate with your strobe. And from here, we're ready to put the housing together into its two pieces. How this is oriented, the way these wings are sitting, isn't really important at this point, because what we're going to do is we're going to bring the two pieces of the housing together. Then when it's sealed up properly, I'm going to go ahead and cam this housing shut. As always, let's do the two side cams together, and then the top one last by itself. Okay, the very last thing I have to do now is install the port on the outside of the housing. But before I do that, I'm going to have to put the focusing ring into position. There are slots located here that line up with the slots in the zoom gear. So what we'll just do is drop this on top, make sure those pieces slide into their respective sleeves, and then make sure that the gear has slid into position so that my focusing knob on the housing is now controlling the zoom movement of this lens back and forth. I'm almost ready to get in. The very last thing I need to do is the port, and in this case I'm using the Ikelite 8-inch dome, although depending on the type of lens you're using, you may be able to do this with a 6-inch dome as well. Get this a little snug there. To put the dome port in place, unlike the other ports which fasten down and then lock into place, with the 8-inch dome, we're using a bayonet type assembly. So all of the 4 port locks or 2 port locks on an order housing would be in place and snap down in their locked position. I always am going to inspect visually this O-ring to make sure that there's nothing on it. And then what we're going to do is we're going to lower the dome down on top of the housing until it seats in. And this is often easiest done by looking at it from the side and finding where the slots will seat. The bayonet assembly has allowed this dome to drop down onto the housing into the slots. So my four port locks, which were in the locked position, have now slid inside the retaining ring of the dome port assembly. So at this point, all I need to do is spin it. Spin it until it stops. And at this point, this port is locked in place and it's ready to go diving.